stand alone. And some of the themes that we're discussing are themes that will carry out throughout the series, and each one sort of builds on each other. And so one of the things that we've seen is when we started with the first session, we looked at Northern French Parshanut, particularly the Parshanut of Rabbi Yosef Kara, also applies to Rashi and Rashbam, and that was the beginning of Pshat interpretation, literary Pshat interpretation, at least in Europe and perhaps in the world in general. In last week, in the second week, we focused on Ramban's Parshanut. And here we saw something very interesting, because if somebody looks at Ramban's Perush al Torah, one will see that he quotes Rashi and Ibn Ezra, but he quotes them almost always to combat them, there'll be sometimes where he quotes Rashi approvingly, but most of the time it's in order to use them as a foil for his own Perushim. But one would think that his own Perushim came yesh me'ayin. They were totally his own creation, uninfluenced by any Parshanim before him. And what we saw last week was that if one digs a little deeper, is that even though Rishonim don't always quote their sources, we saw that Ramban was heavily influenced by Balei Tosafot and Radak. And if we would examine, one can even quantify this. There's an enormous percentage of Ramban which is drawing off those earlier sources. This week we're going to see something similar. This week we're moving to Italy to focus on Rabbi Ovadia Sforno. The approximate dates on him are 1470 to 1550. So we've moved from the 11th, 12th century Rabbi Yosef Kara to 13th France, 13th century Ramban in Spain, and this week now to end of 15th, 16th, and 16th century in Italy. And there's a reason why as we move chronologically, we're also moving geographically. And we started to see this last week also. And just to be able to see this in a graphic representation, so we know that we have tools from the sandwich menu up in the top corner there. So under Kelim, so we know we have tools that we can look at to see Mapata Parshanim and Sir Zman Shel Parshanim. So both a map and a timeline, which allows us sometimes to see some of the broader issues, some of the broader changes, developments in the intellectual history and in the Parshanot. So we can move, when one uses this timeline, so one can either use the filters on the right side and set the years that one wants, the countries that one wants, or to move around on the timeline, one can also move using this bar on top, and it moves it to different centuries, different eras. So here we have year 1000 up in the top corner here. And what we're seeing is that in Christian Europe, particularly in France, I'm not going to do this right now, but we saw last week that if we adjust the filter to just see France, we'll see that that's where the golden age of France is, in quotes. It's not really a golden age of France, no term like that. But then the golden age of Spain is what then takes over from 1200 to 1300 in particular, but it extends until almost 1500, until 1492 for obvious reasons. And that's the end of Spanish Jewry, basically until today. That certainly there's no real further intellectual developments. There's no major Parshanim, no major rabbinic figures after 1492. Where do all those Jews go? So they go to different places and they become different centers. So what we're going to do now is we're going to set the filter to 1500 and 1500 to 1800. And so now we're going to see we're still getting a Barbanel there at the end. Barbanel in the top corner. It's a little hard to see that. So you can see it on your phones, own devices. Of Barbanel, and we're going to see Rabbi Ovadia Sforno is starting right here. And the countries, though, if we use the filter for the different countries and we uncheck everything, so now we're going to see that if we checked Spain, Sfarad HaNotzrit, so we're going to see there's the end of Sfarad HaNotzrit, Rabbi Yitzchak Barbanel, Tzur Hamor, Toldo Yitzchak, that's the uncle of Rabbi Yosef Karo, not Rabbi Yosef Kara, our friend, but Rabbi Yosef Kara, the Shulchan Aruch. and Rabbi Meir Arama, who's the son of Rabbi Yitzchak Arama, the son of Yitzchak, who was a little bit right off the chart. That's Spain, and then blank thereafter. So if we uncheck Spain, though, and we now highlight Italy, so we'll see that Italy now becomes one of the centers where there's a tremendous amount of creativity going on. And we'll see some major figures. Barbanel himself moves to Italy, but he has to run away from Spain, he has to go somewhere. So he winds up in Italy until the end of his life. And we have Rabbi Sforno, we have the Mincha Belula. Later on, we'll have the Melechet Machshevet. And then at the tail end here, the end of the 18th century is already when Rabbi Yitzchak Shmuel Reggio was born. And Rabbi Yitzchak Shmuel Reggio bears mention. This is a little unplanned, but yesterday we were just privileged to receive a new edition of Rabbi Yitzchak Reggio. It's been out of print. It was out of print for a couple hundred years, basically, his commentary. And it was reprinted about 18 years ago, and a new edition of that Perush just came out. And yesterday we were given the rights to incorporate it on Al Torah, and this is a major blessing. It's been on our wish list, so I'm very excited about that. So sorry for the parenthetical interlude. So that's what we can see. We have a whole bunch of major figures going on who are doing all sorts of great parshanut in Italy for a number of centuries. And it gets even better in the 19th century, and that's what we'll cover next week when we get to Shadal, when we get to Shmuel David Lutzato. So that's Italy. Where else do people go after the Gerush from Spain? After they're expelled. So, and we have to keep in mind also that there were expulsions already from France. So there's basically no Jewish community in France already from about 1300, beginning of the 14th century, 1306 or so. So France and Spain, which were the major centers from the last couple of weeks, they no longer exist. So people moved to Italy, and everyone else's loss was Italy's gain. They also moved to North Africa and exactly, and particularly, even though there is some movement to North Africa, but that doesn't become a major center. But Turkey and Eretz Yisrael become the major centers when we mention the Beit Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo with an O before. So that's where he is. That's where his family, which started off in Spain, in Toledo, is not there anymore. Rabbi Yitzchak Karo and Rabbi Yosef Karo was born in Spain. He was, I think, about 3 years old or so during the Gerush. The family moves to Turkey, ultimately to Eretz Yisrael. And then, so we have a whole big centers going on, particularly in which city in Israel? In Tzfat. So that's another major center. And of course, in Eastern Europe, in Poland, in Lithuania, so that's the beginning of the golden age, or the silver age, in Eastern Europe, where in both, particularly in Torah Sheba'al Peh, but also in Parshanut HaMikra, all sorts of important developments going on there. So that's so one can use this table, and of course one can click on any of these figures. These are all links to get to pages about them. So one can use this table and map to get a bird's eye picture of some of the developments, broader developments in Parsha. So as we said, though, this week's focus is on Rabbi Ovadia Sforno, and if we're pretty familiar, Sforno was involved in the original Jewish printing presses, because Sforno basically lived through the very beginning of printing. The first books were printed around 1440. Sforno was born in 1470. Jewish printing, the first Jewish books that we have the date is actually a little unclear, but it's around 1468, 1469, 1470, basically the year of Sforno's birth. Now, all these aspects have an impact, and we'll see some of it as we go along. So Sforno was involved in Jewish printing. Perhaps as a result, his Perushim get incorporated rather early on in Mikra'ot Gedolot type of works. Mikra'ot Gedolot, of course, didn't, like we said last week, didn't exactly exist in the beautiful forms that they exist today. They had less Parshanim in general, but Sforno made it into people's consciousness. He was located in the right place for that, and of course, he produced a pretty good commentary that helps. But one needs, there are lots of good commentaries. They don't all make it into Mikrot Gedot. So
Just a question. The printers themselves, a lot were not Jewish.
correct. And some of them were Mishumadim even. So some of them were converts to Christianity. So anybody complains about non-Jewish influences, and so they have to throw out all their Shasim, all their Mikrot Gedot, all the works that basically were published for centuries. So in any case, Sforno, if we open up his Perushim, which we're all probably all familiar with from the Mikrot Gedot, and you read through Sforno, and as I said last week, the best thing one can do for learning Parshanut is to pick up Parshan every week and to go through it Seder. Sforno is a great choice if one doesn't like Rashbam or Ramban. So if one reads through Sforno, one will see that if one's looking for who's influencing Sforno, who his sources are, once again, nothing. One won't be able to tell, unless one has a very good annotated edition of Sforno, where Sforno is getting all of his Parshanot from. One couldn't be blamed if one read Sforno and got the sense that Sforno, wow, unbelievable, everything is his, everything is created, like we said, Yesh Me'ayin. And what we'll see today is that that's not always the case. And some of what will prove that, even though it's actually very obvious if one compares Sforno to the Parshanim in front of him, but some of what will prove that is some of the manuscripts that we're going to see today. And one other word of Hakdama before we get into things is that the manuscript discoveries that we're going to see today are not my own discoveries. They're the discoveries of my colleague and friend. His name is Rabbi Moshe Kravitz. And he's made some astonishing discoveries in manuscripts that people knew about. But there's a whole bunch of factors that came together at the right time. And he's a wonderful and very, very brilliant person. And he's done a lot of great work over the last 10 years. And I'll give one other word of Hakdama. Rabbi Moshe Kravitz is a Gerach Hasid, and he's about to finish his PhD in a combination of universities in Germany and Italy. And his PhD, his dissertation, is on a student of Rabbi Ovadia Sforno. The student's name was Rabbi Eliyahu Minola. The student himself wrote a Perush, a big Perush on Tehillim. And there are many paragraphs in the student's Perush which parallel Sforno's own commentary. And his dissertation includes in the whole editions about 1,000 pages of this Perush. Altogether, the dissertation is about 1,800 pages. The copy I saw. So you have to have you have to have a lot of time to work through it. So how did I meet Rabbi Moshe Kravitz? So a number of months ago, there was a conference for all sorts of digital tools for studying Torah. And the organizers asked me to, on behalf of Torah, to make a presentation at this conference. And as a result, there were tremendous brachot that came out of this, because there were all sorts of people, especially in the more right-wing world, who weren't that familiar with online resources or weren't familiar with our Torah yet, who got all excited and wanted to share their editions and started using our Torah and started corresponding, and we get tons of communications every day. And one of these people, one day I got a mail from Rabbi Moshe Kravitz, and I see that he sends a correction, which he was absolutely correct. We had a mistake in our edition of one of Sforno's commentaries. And I see his email. I happen to notice his email, which is important because, and I'll explain in a second why his email is important. His email is sforno.nk@gmail.com. Now, everyone might want to write that down. Why is it important? Because these editions and these discoveries and manuscripts, he has published them in hard copy. They're all available on our Torah, but if one wants to learn on Shabbos, our Torah doesn't help you very much. And one can purchase the books in hard copy. They're all very handsomely printed. I didn't bring any examples, but if anybody wants, I can you can contact me. I can show you pictures. You can contact him. And so anybody who wants to purchase these volumes, which I highly recommend, we'll see. I'll mention again at the end when everyone I think will agree with me that these are really fascinating works. So can contact him at that address, Sforno, spelled SFORNO.MK. M is for Moshe, K is for Kravitz, at gmail.com. Okay, so that's my advertisement. But I should add that Rav Moshe, of course, his goal is not to make money on this. If his goal is to make money, so he wouldn't share it on Al Torah. Everything is shared on Al Torah together with the footnotes, with the introductions. Some of them are there already, some of them are coming. So everything he has shared. And this tremendous generosity is really a wonderful person who does tremendous work. And these manuscript discoveries, so like I said, these are things that he's been working on, particularly over the last about the last 10 years or so. Okay, so what happened to allow for these discoveries? So one of the things that happened, one of the important manuscripts that I'm going to open right now, is a manuscript from St. Petersburg. Now, why is that important that it's from St. Petersburg? Because now we can understand why it's only in recent decades that we were able to use these manuscripts, because the Iron Curtain needs to fall. Before we had access, there was about 75 years or so that nobody had access to these manuscripts. If you look in the introduction to Mosai Rav Kook's Sforno, which came out in the 80s, I think, so one will see that the person there did excellent work, but he writes that there's a St. Petersburg manuscript, which he doesn't know what it is. He wasn't able to get any information about it. And it turns out that this St. Petersburg manuscript is incredible. Why is it incredible? Because it's an autograph. It's an autograph, meaning it's Sforno himself wrote this manuscript.
Wow.
How do we know that Sforno himself wrote this manuscript? So we're going to take a look. So from the first page of this manuscript, and we're missing the first page, that's because that got lost at some point. One can't be. There's no real way of being sure. But if we move to a couple pages into the manuscript, what do we start seeing? All sorts of notes on the side, in the lines. Now that doesn't necessarily prove anything either, because we have lots of manuscripts that have glosses on the side, lots of manuscripts where the scribe, as he was copying, so he forgot something, or perhaps the original author added something on the side of his manuscript, on the margins, and then when the person copying the manuscript, they also copied it, the main text and whatever the side notes. So all that means is that the author was adding this. However, if we go down here, now what do we see? Now, don't bother trying to read this script unless you're really an expert in Italian script from the 16th century. This is one of the most miserable scripts to read, which is unfortunate because it means that Rabbi Moshe Kravitz has to read this for me when I need something, and I want to be sure as to what it says. So here we have, though, we don't have to read the text, but we can see that we have crossouts. Now, crossouts already, this is unusual. One doesn't, I've gone through thousands of manuscripts. There's only a handful that have major crossouts on them. Now, I'm actually setting myself up for a problem, because next week we're going to see some big examples of that as well. So there are some exceptions, and it so happens that this week and next week we're hitting like a couple of the only exceptions. And there's a good reason, though, both for this week and next week, why we have these crossouts in the manuscript. Now we're going to move down a couple more pages just to see this, to see the extent of this. So who crosses out in a manuscript? So copyists, when they're copying a manuscript, there's no reason in the world that they would decide that they're crossing things out. The only person who could be crossing things out is the author, or the author was obviously the answer I was fishing for, or the censor, exactly. So if we have, the censor, so if there was some passage that was problematic from Christian perspectives. So then if this was written or got to a country where there was a censor, so then that could have happened. In this case, the crossouts have nothing to do with that. And generally in cases like that, there won't be a crossout just like with lines, there'll be a crossout which tries to blot it out. Now, there'll be some times where you'll be able to read through the erasure or the crossouts, but it's not just somebody making lines like that. The only person, as everyone here said very correctly, that does that is the author himself.
Or his wife.
or somebody making somebody very close to the author, which could be his wife, right? Or it could be a grandson in this case. Yeah. And in this case, Rabbi Ovadia Sforno had a grandson who was very involved in the publication. And there are some places in this manuscript where apparently, and again, I'm saying secondhand. I'm conveying what I know from Rabbi Moshe Kravitz, where Rabbi Hananel Sforno, Rabbi Ovadia Sforno's grandson, where his hand gets involved in this manuscript. But the major crossouts, that has to be the author himself, or somebody doing it on behalf of the author, or like we'll see next week. I'm giving away what we'll see next week a little bit, not that much, but is that if students are copying over from the teacher's manuscript and they're preserving an exact replica of that autograph, so then you can have cases like that as well, where you'll have crossouts. Or especially if the students wrote an original draft, copied from the teacher, and then the teacher changed things while the students were learning from the teacher, then the student will have an original interpretation crossed out and then replaced with a new interpretation that came about while they were in class with that teacher. Either which way, yeah.
Good question. This manuscript is St. Petersburg. It's still in St. Petersburg?
Still in St. Petersburg, but...
So how did this come to be?
Okay, so at the beginning of
somebody had to look at
this manuscript, someone will see that we have here, and everyone here can go to the National Library site and download it. These manuscripts were all digitized by the National Library. So, and what's happened over the last, there have been incredible things that have happened over the last 10 years. There's a whole Katif project at the National Library, which is basically digitizing every Hebrew manuscript or every one that they can get rights to, which is the vast majority that exists. And most of it is now available to anyone. We could go to the National, I don't want to take the time, but we could go.
Never left the St. Petersburg Museum, wherever it is.
Still there.
Okay, so nobody took that home, did this, it's still there, it's always been there.
There are manuscripts that disappear, like in a couple weeks ago we mentioned that Rabbi Yosef Kara's manuscript that disappeared during the Shoah. St. Petersburg manuscripts, basically, as most of them, there may be a few that are unaccounted for during that whole big period that they were AWOL. They weren't AWOL, we just didn't have access to them. That's the difference.
Where were they?
They were in St. Petersburg Library, but we just didn't have the ability to get to them. So this manuscript was digitized. So as soon as access, then in the late 80s, early 90s, as things opened up in Russia. So St. Petersburg and Moscow are huge collections of vast importance for producing editions of Rishonim, both in Torah Shebiktav and Torah Shebal Peh.
How do they make their weights?
So there are all sorts of different collectors. They were, or maybe sometimes they were confiscated. They were bought by the royal collections over the centuries. In Moscow, there's the Gunzburg collection, which I don't know exactly whether it was bought, confiscated. I don't know exactly how it worked, but we're talking about hundreds, if not thousands, of manuscripts in these collections. And they're just like there are all sorts of other libraries around the world. In England, there's Oxford and Cambridge have huge collections of manuscripts, not only Jewish, but tremendous Jewish collections as well. And some of these were pieced together over hundreds of years. A lot of times they were donated, sometimes they were bought. There's a whole big, let's say, for example, an Oppenheim collection, which is part of part of the Oxford collection. We're talking about probably a couple thousand manuscripts. So that was that collection, I think, was bought. So sometimes there are fire sales where if you have enough millions, so then you can buy them. Yeah.
Many of these were written by hand.
They were all manuscripts. Manuscript is generally written. That's what it means. Written by hand.
All by hand.
Manuscript.
Yeah, but what about the copies? Also by hand?
Copies. Meaning this copy, this digital copy, that's photographed. What we're looking at right now.
But the point is, were guys sitting and writing down what they thought?
Yeah, and then people copied. There were either professional scribes who made copies, or individual people. And what would happen is that people, let's say, would go to the author's home. Let's say people went to the Rambam's home, and they would sit there for a few days copying over Mishnah Torah. That we know because we have accounts of this type of stuff.
Were there commercial?
Yeah. So there would be professional scribes. That was their profession. And if they could, and if you had nice penmanship, then you could copy quickly. So you could make a lot more money than if you had lousy script and were slow.
A system where there's financial people involved.
Yeah.
To buy and sell.
Yeah, absolutely. It was much more expensive. To buy any work in medieval times, you had to be wealthy.
Yeah.
And that's why libraries were much smaller. And when we talk about people not quoting things, and people, so some of that is impacted by that as well. People, I don't know. People had at some periods we know that people didn't even have a sitter.
Yeah.
So it's a totally different world. When we appreciate what we have today. It's and compare it to what existed 10 years ago, and then we move back 100 years ago and 1,000 years ago. It's really mind-boggling.
But it means that there be a number of Jews who are quite wealthy enough to buy these things.
Yeah. And in some cases, they're wealthy enough to buy them. In some cases, they were wealthy enough to even support and sustain the writing of the Pirush. Like we know, for example, in Ibn Ezra's case, so he would basically sell his services. There were people who paid him to write Pirushim. They were his sponsors. They financed his work. Just like today, we have philanthropists who support all sorts of scholarship and parshanut and spreading Torah in all sorts of ways. Exactly. That has actually always been there. In Sforno's case, just to bring back to Sforno for a second, so Sforno had a brother whose name was also Hananel, just like the grandson. The grandson was named after Sforno's brother. And basically they had a Yisachar Zvulun partnership. Sforno himself was not of great means. And his brother Hananel basically supported him, and Sforno dedicates some of his Perushim in the beginning of Iyov, at least in some versions of it. So we'll see that he dedicates the Perush to his brother. And we have other letters between them. His brother is giving Sforno tremendous financial support, which is what allowed Sforno to do what he did. And that was not uncommon. In the Rambam's case, for example, Rambam also, his brother, the Rambam writes, so his brother, when his brother dies at a very young age, so the Rambam's whole source of support suddenly disappeared. At the end, he did okay in the palace in Egypt. So he
was a doctor. So
exactly. He was able to support himself. But at one point there seems to be great concern. Okay, so anyhow, so back to our manuscript though. So here we see already there's so much going on in this manuscript. It becomes clear that this could only be the author himself. And if we continue, this goes on throughout the manuscript. It doesn't stop. So this manuscript. So that's one of the ways. Now, of course, I'm simplifying the things a little. But this is clearly Sforno's autograph. And why is this so important? Because when we compare this to Sforno's Perush, so we'll see that there are basically throughout the Perush, there are very, very distinct similarities. In some cases, it's verbatim what we have in the published commentary. But in other cases, there are tremendous changes. And this is what we call a Mahadura Kama. Now, we also talked about Madura Kamas in the context of Ramban. But this is a much different type of Madura Kama, because in the case of Ramban, we were talking about the vast majority of the Pirush, maybe, I don't know, 95, 97% of the Pirush is that original layer. And there are just all sorts of new information, new addition, new sources that he gets, that he now has at his disposal when it comes to, sorry, keep a nice picture up, so that way. When he comes to Eretz Yisrael. But the majority of that Perush, so we're talking about updates, rather than really a first version and a second version. In Sforno's case, here we're really talking about a first version. We're talking about a Madura Kama. Now this Madura Kama, unfortunately, is not up on Al Torah because it was published by Oz V'Hadar. And we haven't. We have to speak to them and see if we can work out an arrangement that we'll be able to use this Madura Kama on our Torah, because it's fascinating to be able to compare and see the evolution of Sforno's commentary between his original draft, what he takes out, what he adds, what he changes, and our later edition. But what we do have is an even earlier stage than the Madura Kama, and that's what's so incredible about the case of Sforno, and the discoveries that have gone on over the last 10 years. So St. Petersburg was known; it wasn't fully appreciated what it was, but now we're getting to a second manuscript, which was available to everyone. Never was inaccessible, but of course today, when we say available today, means something different than available 30 years ago. And this actually bears on this story as well. This is the Montefiore 29 manuscript. So Montefiore is in Moshe Montefiore. So he was a big collector of manuscripts among all his other tremendous achievements. And this and his collection is now in London. And this manuscript, which if one looks at it, and I'll blow it up a little, it doesn't look like much of a manuscript from the first page, because what we'll see is that this manuscript is written on the margins. It's really a printing, and on the margins of the printing, we don't see it yet on this page, but on the margins of this printing, somebody writes extensive notes. In fact, entire commentaries are written on the side of this manuscript. So that's why it's called a manuscript, because of the later pages. We'll just scroll down for a second to see some examples.
This is a printed book.
This is a printed book, and we'll identify it in a second. If anyone is into medieval Parshanut, you may have seen enough already to be able to figure out who this is, because there's really only one book that I know that looks like this. But now we'll start seeing on the side of the manuscript. Okay, whoops, I gave it away also by putting up here, if anyone can see that print. I can make it a little bigger. Amar, it's Rabbi, Amar Levi ben Gershom, and the way one can know who this is if one looks at many of the pages of the manuscript. So this printing is very, very distinct. We'll see Toalot. Ralbag writes about what are the lessons that we learn, and I'm not getting to one of those pages. Okay, but at the end of
what is the date of what we're seeing?
I'm sorry?
What is the date of what we're
So
seeing?
this was 15th century. I forget, 1480 was when, or something like that, is when the work is published. It's one of the first printings of Rabbi, if not the first printing. And on the side of this manuscript, somebody, like we started to see before, in many of the pages, somebody is adding all sorts of notes, again in this lousy Italian script, which is almost illegible, except that we have people who, Baruch Hashem, are able to read it. So here's another example where we'll see that along the side of this commentary. So I say this is always available, but available today is vastly different. Available today means I press a button, I go to the National Library site, I press a button, I download the whole manuscript, I can do whatever I want with it. I can blow it up, I can get, if I want, I can order higher quality images. Availability 30 years ago was not so wonderfully simple. And in fact, the first person, it turned out that I found out a couple months ago, because a different friend of mine got to this manuscript, never published his findings, but actually knew about what was going on the side of this manuscript, because he is a scholar of Ralbag. So he, in the course of working on Ralbag's commentary, he got to this manuscript and suddenly discovered some of the stuff that was on the side, but he never published it. So it's a lesson that if you make a discovery and it's important, publish it, or somebody else might beat you to it. So that's sort of what happens in this case. But either which way, all sorts of good people involved. And on this, so we have this first printing of, I think it's the first printing of Rabbi. And on the side, we have this other work being written. What's going on? So on the first page of this work, if we go back up top, so there's somewhat ambiguous. It's a little hard to read. Part of it's a little cut off. We have somebody signing this, and this word over here says matzliach. I'm sorry. This word matzliach. This may say shekatav. It's up in the air. Underneath it, we have a difference, and this looks like it may be the hand, the same penmanship of the person writing the notes on the side. Even that's a little hard to tell, because when a person's signing things, he's going to write differently than when the person's writing on the margins. So this requires some paleographer to do more careful analysis. So we can't quite figure out what the name is, but we have a Rabbi Matzliach Minola. So who is this Rabbi Matzliach Minola? And is there some other word? Is it Shabtai? Is it Shekatav? All these questions haven't been fully resolved. But I can tell you what Rabbi Moshe Kravitz has tried to establish, and I think there's good solid ground for this. He thinks that this manuscript, the person writing the notes on the side, is Sforno's student. What's clearly Sforno's student, because that we know from the content. But he thinks it's this Rabbi Eliyahu Minola, because this manuscript has tremendous parallels to Rabbi Eliyahu Minola's own commentaries, which we mentioned earlier. Either which way, whatever, if it's Matzliach, if it's Eliyahu Matzliach, whatever this is a student of Sforno. How do we know? Because if one can read all that Italian stuff, Italian script on the side, it's Hebrew, and of course, in Italian script, though, on the side of the manuscript, so we'll see there's tremendous parallels to Sforno's Perushim, just like in the St. Petersburg manuscript. But there are also additional parts of this manuscript. It's so long; it's 430 or so pages. This work. Not all the pages have material on the sides, but most of them do. And in some cases, where there's no Perush ala Torah that's being written on the side, there's Perushim from other works of Sforno, including his Perushim on Kohelet and Shir HaShirim, which we have from other manuscripts and were printed already in the 16th century. Sforno's grandson was responsible for having those printed as well. And we then have unknown commentaries of Sforno that nobody knew existed until the last few years, including a commentary on Yeshayahu and a commentary on Ruth, which have since been published. And if anybody wants, like I mentioned before, if anybody wants a copy of Sforno's commentary on Ruth, timely, or Sforno's commentary on Yeshayahu, sforno.mk@gmail.com. Rabbi Moshe Kravitz is the person to contact for that. So we have all sorts of perushim going on in this manuscript. We have a perush ala Torah, and we also have perushim on Nevi'im and Ketuvim. We don't have a full set of all 24 Sfarim, but we have several, and in the cases of Ruth and Yeshayahu, two perushim that were unknown until now. Now there's differences between these different perushim. The perush ala Torah has the words Amar Hagaon repeatedly, and in some of the perushim on Nevi'im and Ketuvim, so it's Hagaon Zatzah, which means that there's a difference as to when these perushim are being written. The perushim ala Torah, for example, which have the Amar Hagaon, which is Sforno Bibirkata, and will sometimes have Sforno Bibirkata Chayim, so they're clearly being written during Sforno's lifetime. And afterwards, the other perushim, some of these perushim anach, are not being written from Sforno himself, but are being copied from Sforno's own perushim, but Sforno is already no longer alive. The perushim, what it turns out is that the perushim on Torah are being written by somebody sitting in Sforno Shir. Sforno was giving classes, and sometimes there'll be participation of the people in the Shir. So what we have here is something that even predates the Madura Kama of Sforno, the one that we saw in the St. Petersburg manuscript. That was Sforno's own first draft. This is a student taking notes from Shir. And we all know today that so many books start out as lecture notes. A teacher gives, maybe someday, maybe this will become up. So a teacher gives lectures, and what happens? Everyone says, "Wow, that was really wonderful. Why don't you write a book?" And the person says, "Wow, that must be wonderful. So I'll write a book." So it takes time, and the lecture notes, if somebody recorded the lectures, if somebody took down good notes from the lectures, so then, or the person himself has his notes from his lectures, and he puts them together, and it takes many years, and it goes through a Madura Kama and a Madura Batra. Exactly what happened in this case of Sforno. Sforno's Perushim apparently started as a series of lectures, and he had some good people in his shiur. We know a little about some of the people. And these notes were recorded by the students, whether it's Rabbi Eliyahu Minola, whether it's a Rabbi Matzliach Minola, whoever it is who's recording these notes. And here we can have a first version, which it turns out is sometimes almost exactly what we have in Sforno's own commentary. In other cases, it preserves material that never made it into the commentary for whatever reason. Either Sforno cut it, maybe Sforno's grandson cut it. So in a lot of these cases, we have to think about it as to what we can examine what the reasons are that happened. So we have all sorts of new material of Sforno, which will sometimes supplement or complement Sforno's Perushim. Sometimes it will explain things that weren't so clear in the Perush that we have. But here we have a different version of it, which will sometimes clarify points that one wouldn't have been able to know from the Perush itself.
Are you going to show some examples?
That's what we're getting to right away. So we're going to open up.
In such situations, what is your attitude toward the first draft?
So in our case, since we're not dealing with halakha l'maaseh issues, these aren't life and death type of cases. It doesn't really matter that much to us. It matters for scholarly reasons to establish which one is first, which one is second, which one is third. In these cases, we have all sorts of levels in the case of Sforno, but it doesn't matter that much because what we're more interested in is having the material, and then we can evaluate it ourselves if we think that it's a good perush, if it helps us, if it contributes to our understanding of the text of Tanakh. So it doesn't matter so much whether Sforno himself might have rejected it. We might say, well, yeah, we like Sforno's first version better than the second version. So we're going to see some examples now, and I think some of that will become a little clearer. So let's go back up to under Tanakh now you can always set your to either English or Hebrew when you're using this. So this happens to be on English right now. So we're going to go to the Mikrot Kedot, and the wonderful thing is that what this Amar HaGaon Perush, these notes of Sforno student, so these are available for everyone to use in the Mikrot Gedolot. For basically, this is the first time ever that they're digitally available. And any text, basically almost every pasuk in Torah, one can see the notes of the students. And not every pasuk. There's some sukkah that doesn't comment, but a great majority of them, one can see Sforno's students' notes. And why is this so useful? Because when we learn, the most important tool for learning, basically in all areas of life, is having a foil, being able to compare and contrast. One's able to compare and contrast. One notices things that one wouldn't have noticed otherwise. Right? If one just reads a text, especially if it's a long text, but even a short text, one can just read right through things, and one doesn't know how to focus. One doesn't always notice the important peculiarities. If one has something to compare and contrast, that already gets one thinking. Now, the truth is, we can make our own foils. In Rabbi Yosef Karo, we said we can't read Rabbi Yosef Karo without reading Rashi. In Ramban's case, we shouldn't be reading Ramban without reading all the major parshanim that came before him. And all of those will shed light and will cause us to think better about Ramban. In Sforno's case, we can do something even one step better. We can compare Sforno original draft. So we can compare Sforno to himself, exactly. Compare Sforno's original draft with if when we get the rights Bezrat Hashem to the second draft and to the third draft. But for now, we can compare the first draft at least and the third draft. So what we're going to do is in the electronic Mikra Gedolah, we can set which parshanim are on the page. So let's say where the Mikra Gedolah starts out with a default configuration of Mefarshim. And we decide that right now we're not interested in Rabbi Yosef Kara and Ramban. So what we'll do is we'll go to the gear menu, the gear button up on top. This is important, even though it's not exact content, but this is most basic one of the most basic things one needs to know in order to use our Torah. From this gear menu up on top center there, one can choose which parshanim by checking them. So we can do, and you can select them all, you can remove all, and then select the ones that you want. So we're going to do Haser Hakol, rather than unchecking these individually, we'll just do one full swoop and uncheck everything. So now if we went back to the page, we would have nothing on the page. And we're going to check Rabbi Ovadia Sforno and Shiurei Sforno.
That's the Gira Rabbi, right?
I'm sorry?
The Gira Rabbi.
So we're going to check both of Sforno's commentaries, and we will now have the Ger Rebbe's version of Shiurei Sforno, exactly. And here we have, so now we have on this pasuk, the way the Bereshit will show you more, so we don't have Sforno's own Perush, but we do have Shiurei Sforno. Here we have Sforno and not Shiurei Sforno, so sometimes that will happen. In other psukim, we'll have both of them side by side. What's a good example of that? This parak isn't so good for that. Okay, sorry, bad example for that.
So you can also go to like the choose database, and there's Shiurei Sfornos under that, right?
In the library, right? We're now in the Mikra Gedolah, and this Mikra Gedolah is what I recommend for learning Chumash, learning Tanakh. Mikra Gedolah is the best way. In the full library, so then you can get all texts all together on both Torah Shebiktav, Torah Shebal Peh, Machshava, everything in the full library. Yeah. So then you can order your tree any way you want there, alphabetically, chronologically, geographically. So that's yeah. So but for us right now, we want to get a little bit of a taste of some of the things that are exciting about these Shiurei Sforno. So here we have an example of an incredible Perush of Sforno, which doesn't exist, didn't make the cut for some reason. I don't know why. It's upsetting even that this didn't make the cut into his final Perush al Torah. But we're going to take a look and we'll blow it up a little. So we okay? You back? Can everyone see? Yeah? Great. So by the Moshe V'Aaron Limor Zot Chukat HaTorah She'Tziva Hashem et Moshe Daber Bnei Yisrael Pasuk Bet V'Yikchu Elecha Parah Duma Tzumima Asher Ein Ba'mum Asher Lo Ala Aleha O. Parashat Parah Duma. One of the big questions that all the Mefarshim have to grapple with is, why is this section located here in Parashat Chukat? Why? What's the problem? Why would we expect that it shouldn't be in Parashat Chukat? It should have been someplace else. Because Parah Duma was necessary for cleansing, for purifying oneself in order to do Avodat HaMishkan. Now the Mishkan exists long before Parashat Chukat. In fact, in Parshat Behalotecha, when we talk about the purification of the Leviim in order they'll be able to serve, one of the parts of the process, one of the steps was Hazei Alehem Mechatat. People here. Hazei Alehem Mechatat. What is Mechatat? Mechatat we know from this parak. We might not have known in that pasuk what it was. Mechatat is the mayim that has the ashes of the Parah Duma that are then sprinkled in order to be mitzaher everyone from Tumat Met. And Chazal say that the Parashat Parah Duma was one of the parshiot that was given on the first day of Chanukat HaMishkan. If so, though, so not only from a Torah Shebal Peh, not only from a Midrashic perspective, but even from a Pshuto Shel Mikra perspective, we have people who we know who were Tmei Meit. For example, in Parashat Shmeini, a couple weeks ago, Nadav and Abihu are killed, and then we have Mishael and Eltzafan who have to drag them out. According to Chazal, they then become the people who need a Pesach Sheni because they weren't Sahor for Pesach Rishon. Also timely. So we know that we needed paraduma. We needed this right before Parashat Chukat. So what's it doing in Parashat Chukat? And all the Mefarshim grapple with this question. And in Sforno's case, I think we have a fabulous interpretation. Amar Hagaon. Afal pisha para b'chodesh hashlishi hayta. Kemo she'amru zichronam libracha. Like Chazal said, b'chodesh hashlishi lisrifat para. And if you look in the footnote here, there's an extensively annotated Perush. So the Mahadir, Rabbi Moshe Kravitz notes, "Lo matzati makor was it?" That this isn't exactly what we see in Chazal. The other Makorim in Chazal talk about Basheni rather than Bashlishi. Okay, but you can check all the source work afterwards. The old Ketiv b'Tarat HaLeviim hazei alehem mechatat. The pasuk we just mentioned in Kain Kfar Hayata. Amra po bazeh hamakom haTorah lefi shekishehosifu lachato al dvar korach nitvasfa alehem tumat ohel shebarishona lo hayta lahem liyisrael zot hatumah v'tumat ohel mora al roa hashchuna v'zeh haya bidvar korach kemo she'amru zal in the Midbar Rabbah alav oy larasha ve'oy lishchino. What's Sforno doing here in these lectures? So Sforno is doing something very, very, very clever. What Sforno is doing is he's saying sometimes we have a mitzvah that has many, many parts to it, has multiple details. And we can have a case, sometimes this is true about stories also. We can have a story in Tanakh which takes place over the course of time. For example, a good example of that is, let's say, the story of Yitro. When Yitro comes, so Yitro comes to Moshe, he visits him, then he gives advice over the judges, that advice is then implemented, and Yitro returns then to his Vayerocho El Arzo. And that didn't all happen in the 5 minutes that it takes us to read that Aliyah. That all happened, that didn't even happen over the course of one day. That happened at least over the course of many, many days, because right to appoint that system of judges, especially if we're talking about 600,000 with all the Sariyas Chamishim, Sariyas Sarot. So that wasn't something that happened overnight. It's possible that this even took place, according to some Mefarshim, over the course of more than a year. So we have events, sometimes in a story, multiple events, which shouldn't all be viewed as all part of the one story, even though they're grouped together because they're part of a common theme. They're connected to each other, even though they didn't take place all at the same time. Similarly, with halachic material, and in this case, this is what Sforno is doing here with his clever application to Paraduma. We have the halachot of Tumat Meit, but we have a long parak about the halachot of Tumat Meit. It could be what Sforno suggests is that some of those halachot were given already on an earlier occasion, when, of course, they were needed already. Like we said, Hazei alehem mechatat. One had to have a basic paraduma in order to purify the Leviim. Clearly, part of this parasha was already given. But Sforno says, if we look at this parasha, and we know we can always click on the icon here to see the whole parak. So we'll see that the first part of the parasha discusses what to do, how to make the mechatat, shechting the paraduma, etc. And then the second part starts to focus in pasuk Yud Daled. Zot HaTorah. Now notice again, that's the key words, Zot Chukat HaTorah and Zot HaTorah get repeated here. This is a new opening, this is a whole new section to the text. Zot HaTorah, Adam Ki Amud Be'ohel. Chol HaBa'el HaOhel, V'chol Asher Ba'ohel, Yitzmach Kivat Yamim, Chol Kali Patuach, Chol Asher Yigal Panei HaSadeh. So we have special dinim that relate to Tumat Ohel. Not just somebody who comes into actual physical contact with a corpse, but somebody who's in the same ohel, somebody who's under the same roof as a mate. And the psukim later, so clearly the tumat ohel aspect of this parasha is a very significant one. And Sforno says that's the solution. We now have a perfect solution to our problem. On one hand, we know that this parasha had to be given earlier. On the other hand, it's given here. So what happens here? Something must have changed. And what did the Torah do? Because even though the original tzivui was given earlier, but the Torah doesn't record every single thing that happens. Sometimes the Torah will wait to record something in order to organize things in a better way. Because what would it have had to have done? It would have to have given part of the parasha Paraduma at the time in which, in the beginning of the, let's say, when the Mishkan was established and the Leviim were purified, and then it would have to come back to it. Now it's true, the Torah sometimes does do things like that. But in this case, the Torah decided, HaKadosh Baruch Hu decided, let's put all of the psukim about the same issue together. In order to do that, one had to wait until it was all given. So even though the first part of the parasha was given already in, let's say, the beginning of the second year, already in the first year that they were in the Midbar, the Torah waited to record it until after Parashat Korach, right? The parasha that immediately precedes Parashat Chukat. Now, what's the connection to Parashat Korach? So there's another step here. Now, before we get to that step, I want to actually contrast this to Rav Yosef Kara, who we're familiar with from the first week, and because there's something very nice in Rav Yosef Kara. So you can now we selected only Sforno and Shirei Sforno from here, but in any pasuk, even once you've made your selection, if you want on an individual pasuk to get quick access to other parshanim on that pasuk, so you hit that show additional commentaries button. Hatzeg Mefarshim Nosafim. I close it right now, but here you see at the bottom of every pasuk. So you have these. So you can, if you want, you can go back to the gear menu and then reset your Mefarshim that you want to see. But if you really want to see, in this case, we only want to see Sforno, but we happen to want to access other Mefarshim. So that's what with this Hatzeg Mefarshim Nosafim button is there to make life easier. And we're going to click on Rav Yosef Kara here. So now we'll have Rav Yosef Kara on this pasuk as well. Rav Yosef Kara says Parashat Paraduma al Haseder Ne'amra. לפי שדיבר למעלה והיו המתים במגפה, אי אפשר שלא נגעו בקרוביהם, והוצרך לפרש טהרתה. So Rabbi Yosef Kara gives an explanation which is slightly similar to Sforno. What they share is that they're both connecting the placement of Paraduma to Parashat Korach. What Rabbi Yosef Kara suggests is that Parashat Korach is the first time that we have a large-scale magifa. There's Efshar Shalom Nagu Bikrovihem, and therefore we needed the parasha of Paraduma, the Taharami Tumat Meit, right afterwards. Now one could quibble about that because there are some magifot in Parashat Al-Lotzacha. The numbers though aren't so clear. And Shlach Korach, let's say, is the first magifa, and we have Vayipominam Shoshet Al Peish in Parashat Kitisai after Cheta Egel, but in Korach, so it's already over 17,000 people that are killed. So one might be able to argue about it. In any case, that's what Rabbi Yosef Kara suggests. Now notice in the parentheses, there's Taviad Moskva Imachatima Rabbi Yosef, because this was part of the reconstruction that we talked about a couple weeks ago. What we have is in certain manuscripts of Rashi, we have Rabbi Yosef Kara's notes or glosses, his additions, his places where he disagrees with Rashi. And this is a manuscript of not Rabbi Yosef Kara's Perush, but Rashi's Perush, Moscow, 1827, which again only became available after the fall of the Iron Curtain. And on this Perush, in the middle of Rashi's manuscript, we then have Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef is Rabbi Yosef Kara. So that's how we have this Perush of Rabbi Yosef Kara. Sforno, though, takes a different approach. He says the connection isn't that there were more people killed in this Magifa, but that there was something added. There were new dinim that were added. And this is very, very important because this relates to one of Sforno's big overarching theses that spans his entire commentary on Torah. And we're going to see more sources on that in a second. What Sforno is suggesting here is that as a result of sins, there were new halachot that were given. And Sforno will do this repeatedly throughout Torah. After every sin, new mitzvot were given in order to be a corrective. Now, here, what Sforno says is, what was the sin of Korach? So if we remember, there's a very interesting pasuk. And this is probably the first time where we have such a notion in the Torah. And when Chazal say, Oy l'rashav v'oy l'shchino, even though that doesn't sound like it has to do with pshat of the psukim, the truth is almost always underlying Chazal's midrashic formulation is tremendous insights into the simple reading of the verse. what do we have in Parshat Korach that we've never had before? We've had a concern for people coming close, being in the vicinity of the person doing a chet. We've had people before who did chatzaim, but we've never had a case where Moshe says something like suruna, like he says by Korach, suruna me'al ohalei ha'anashim harishayim ha'ila ve'al tigeu b'chol shalem pen tisafu b'chol chazotam, which rings a bell. What bell is that? Pen tisafu. Where have we had that before in Torah? Breshit. By Lot, by Sodom. What we have here is just like the concern, and the concern by Sodom was exactly the same concern, that Lot would be Penti Safeh Ba'avon Ha'ir. He would be caught up in the punishment that was being given to the entire city. Now, what is going on is by Korach and Adato, the earth opens up. And so, for obvious reasons, anyone who's going to be in their vicinity is going to be swallowed up. So that's somewhat different than what's it by the. I'm sorry.
Like by love.
Right, exactly. So you had to be so Oyla Rashav Oyusheno is really on a physical level here as well. But that's what Chazal are picking up on, and that word Ohel. Suruna me'al ohalei hanashim harishayim ayuah. Now Sforno doesn't bring that here, but I'm almost positive that that's what's going on in his mind. And Sforno says, as a result, we want a connection to the sin, right? The mitzvot that are then given, the details that are then given, are a reminder, zikaron livnei Yisrael, like we have after Adad Korach. And so Sforno says the whole dinim of Tumat Ohel, the concept of me'al ohalei hanashim harishayim ayuah, the concept of people of guilt by association, is something that Parashat Korach was mechadesh, and therefore, on the flip side, the tikkun also gives us the dinim of Tumat Ohel. Now we said that Sforno, this is a concept that Sforno develops throughout his Perush, and it starts with his hakdama to his Perush al Torah. So we're going to go to the Sefer Breshit. So in the Hakdama, we have a very long Hakdama, and this is something that Sforno is really one of the first Perushim to give such an overarching Hakdama, which basically carries through all of Torah and shows and gets into even the details. And we have an example where we have Sforno himself and Shirei Sforno, and we're going to see we're hopefully going to see things from both of them. And we'll skip because so Aniyat Seir Ovadia, so that paragraph is his introduction. He mentions Hananel, the Kol Divrei Moreno Arav Hananel Achi, and so that's this is like where the donor page, where you all the thank yous, acknowledgements. So we have some of that here in Sforno's Hakdama, and then he gets to discussing, basically he goes through Torah here, and you can sort of see just from the sources, Breshit Tet, so he's going through Parshat Noach, talking about changes that happened as a result of the sins of the Mabul, and what he's suggesting here is that because of the sin, so then Besur Tikvat Shubat Hamin HaEnoshi Bichlalo, Kasher Konin Lashchi Kol Tikun Eloki Pamayim Shalosh. So after we had the Mabul, we had Dor Palaga, so he flashed in Chasibo Mikoaminu Bachar Bi Abraham Vizaro. And this is we don't have time to go through the whole Hakdama here, but he basically goes through all of Torah, trying to explain what was the process that's going on. What is Hashem doing? And Sforno's thesis basically is any time that there's a sin, so Hashem responds to it. Hashem responds to it with trying to correct the world, to remedy the sin. And then he goes through Meirov Shlemut Shlosha Eloi, talking about the Avot here. Hayu Piloteihem Misabrot Batorah Maspikot Lahorot V'Dorot Ikarei HaKorot. So the actions of the Avot have impact on generations after them. Who's this sound like? Ramban. Masavot Siman Labanim. There's two major influences that pervade Sforno's Perush, even though he doesn't mention them explicitly. One of them is Ramban. The other is the Rambam. basically, what one could sort of formulate is that Rambam plus Ramban, and they were very different people, and Sforno was taking different things from both of them, equals Sforno. If you want to make a mathematical equation for Sforno's Pirush. Now that's oversimplification. There's obviously other influences, and Sforno has his own ideas, but that in rough terms, that would describe Sforno's Pirush. So Sforno continues through the Avot, and what we want to get to though is the period after Mitzrayim, after Yetziat Mitzrayim. So as a result of all these good actions that Bnei Yisrael take, they're now worthy of going into Eretz Yisrael. But of course, it doesn't stay that way. But then uvadu bidvar hamiraglim uvechein hishchitu inyanam v'nigzera lihem mitzah b'midbar v'lo nichnesu abanim la'aretz b'iltzim milchama v'im zeh sabavu aratzot hamim 40 shana. V'siper shlishi ki b'chol elu lo chalu rachamei hakel litzakein inyan habanim k'fi she'efshar k'fi ha'efshar v'tziva al niskei yachid v'hachala u'sirei avodah zarah. Sforno says we have some interesting things going on right after Parashat HaMeraglim in Parak Tedvav and Parashat B'midbar and Sefer B'midbar. We have mitzvot that are given. These mitzvot, Sforno says, are connected to the Chet of the Meraglim. Similarly, after Chet HaEgel, I think I skipped it when I was scrolling here. So Sforno says. V'hima maru b'naksu et yam v'zuato behar chorev right after Maseh Ha'egel v'siper sheni ki b'chol zot lo chadal hakel yibarach l'takein inyanam, the same idea of tikkun v'ofen ma l'shochno b'tocham v'ksiva mlechet hamishkan v'kelim v'tikkun kohanim la'avodatam u'bazeh hishiv shchinato b'tocham achar tachlit v'kilkul v'hayeush. The end of Shemot. So what Sforno is suggesting is that the Mishkan is a tikkun for Chet HaEgel. Now this we know from earlier Mefarshim, but Sforno does it in a slightly different way. Like, for example, the Rambam views Mishkan and Korbanot as something of a b'diavad, and it has to do with it results from Bnei Yisrael's sin. The Chet HaEgel basically proved that Bnei Yisrael needed some physical, concrete representation for their religious worship. Sforno is not going in that direction. It's a combination. It's true that it's related to Chet. In that way, he's like the Rambam. But for Sforno, the whole idea of the Mishkan isn't some sort of b'diavad that we don't really that's a concession to idolatrous impulses, but it's a tikkun. Hashem realized that Bnei Yisrael need a tikkun, need a lechatchila representation, and that way he's much more like Ramban, who views the Mishkan as a lechatchila. So now we had additional korbanot as well as chukei kashrut. All of this, the beginning of Sefer Vayikra, it's from Sforno's perspective, is coming about as a tikkun for Chet HaEgel. So we had Chet HaEgel. As a result of that, we have certain mitzvot that weren't given before that. According to Sforno, chukei kashrut is a prime example. All these korbanot, in fact, having a center rather than Sforno points to the pasuk before Chet HaEgel. It sounds like anyone can go build a mizbeach, any place they want, like we know from according to Chazal, Heter Bamot. So we have that would have been the way of worshiping Hashem. It became clear as a result of Chet HaEgel that wasn't viable to have everyone building their mizbachot, because what would that degenerate into? Idolatrous worship. As a result, everything has to become centralized. So that's Sforno's understanding of how the Mishkan is working. As a result of Chet HaMeraglim, there were additional mitzvot given, and like we just saw, as a result of the Chet of Korach, there are additional mitzvot given. So this is something that Sforno takes throughout his whole Pirush al Torah. Many examples. It's probably the most overarching thing. In this case, in his Pirush, though, we wouldn't have known it. It's only because we have the Shiurei Sforno, the students' notes that recorded this one. For some unknown reason, this didn't make it into Sforno's final copy.
So without Beit, there'd be no mitzvah.
So this is a very interesting point. And because what does that sort of remind one of? Who basically promulgate that idea that mitzvot are really only because of chataim? It's a very Christian concept.
I didn't want to say the word.
For Christians, right? The reason why they don't have to do all the mitzvot of the Torah is because they're not stiff-necked people like we are. And
Someone died for their sins already.
and what's fascinating about this is that Sforno, of all of the mefarshim that we have, Sforno was probably the parshan who had the most contact with the Gentile world. Sforno, in fact, was a tutor for cardinals. He apparently got paid very well. That was how he supported when his brother, I guess, wasn't supporting him. So that was a big part of Sforno's income, because the cardinal writes about how he had to pay this one ducat. I forget what the coin was, for every lesson. Apparently, a huge, a small fortune that he would pay for every lesson. Sforno taught him grammar, biblical Hebrew. Basically, this is the first course in biblical Hebrew that was open to non-Jews. That was Sforno.
Sure, it's
So we
worth
have.
it.
What's that?
I'm sure it was worth it.
Apparently he did it for a while, so he didn't complain. I mean, maybe he complained, but he continued paying. Yes. So Sforno was probably a very good teacher, and we can now read his shiurim online and in print. Okay, so we have a couple more minutes. So it's not only a couple more minutes. So I'm gonna give a few more samples quickly. We're not going to go into all the details, but anyone who wants to, it's all available for everyone to look at. One of the great things in this in the Shirei Sforno, in this manuscript, is that there's also 14. There's a group of klalim, Sforno's methods, which I don't know if Sforno dictated in class, or the student basically was able to select them from Sforno's material. And these are published in the Hakdama to Breshit in the Shirei Sforno. This is the regular Sforno's Perush side, which is a Hakdama well worth reading. And in the Shirei Sforno side, we have those klalim. And we'll just see a couple interesting examples. Klalim Gaon. So Amar HaGaon, klal number 1. Kol makom shene'emar ve'ata asay, etc. Kol v'cho, kemo ve'ata haremet matzacha v'chayotze. רוצה לומר, אני או אחרים יעשו זה וזה, ואתה תעשה זה. שאני ואתה הם שני עניינים מצטרפים, באופן זה בכל התורה כולה. Sforno says, anytime you have a ve'ata, there's a contrast going on. There's, I will be doing this, but you be doing something else. So even though the pasuk might not be explicit as to that relationship between the two, you have to connect them. There's a partnership going on. Amar HaGaon, number 2. Kol ketel milah b'Torah kemo yadoa teda, where we have a repetition using the shem hapol, the infinitive. Kemo yadoa teda. Asot taseh, ga'o ga'a, dalo dala, v'chayotze. רוצה לומר בכולם, אף על פי שמן הדין לא היה זה ואין הדעת נותן, מכל מקום בוודאי יהיה. Why do we have these forms, these doubling forms? So Sforno says they're an emphasis. There are other parshanim who suggest that it's for emphasis, but Sforno takes it a step further. Sforno says these will come up, these type of double formulations will come up when you might have had a hava amina, you might have thought that this couldn't happen or wouldn't happen. And if one looks at Sforno's Perushim on all these cases, we're not going to make it right now. So then one will see that if you would read the regular Perush, you might not understand that this is the method that Sforno, what's motivating Sforno to say what he's doing. With these klalim, one can basically, now one has the keys to understanding Sforno's Perush. And these klalim were never available until the Shirei Sforno were published. And so we have 14, including one that everyone who's here the first week should be familiar with, Amar HaGaon, Vayaged eino ela l'shon sipur hagadat ma. Avalochen vaydaber o vayomer. This we saw in Rav Yosef Kara the first week. It's basically the same approach that we have in Sforno. Sforno is saying is that Vayaged Haggadah is opposed to, in contrast to Vaydaber Lashon of Dibur or Amira, has to do with events that happened in the past. So 14 different klalim here, but I want to bear with me for we're a little over time, but 2 minutes, because I want to see something from Megillat Root, from Sforno's new Perush on Root that's never been published, that was never until a couple of years ago. So we'll turn to Megillat Root, and we're going to go to Perek Gimel. And we'll go to the gear menu again and turn off all the gear menu has different settings for Nach and Torah. So we have to do the same thing for Nach. We're going to turn off everything except for Sforno. And okay, so here we have in Perek Gimel of Megillat Ruth, we have in the middle of the story, Naomi is now concerned about Ruth's future. This is after they've come back to Eretz Yisrael. And Ruth has already encountered Boaz. That was all Perek Bet in Megillat Ruth. She's been in his field. He's been very generous to her, provided for her, told her to stay in the field until the end of the harvesting until the end of the season. And now, Vatomer la Naomi Chamutach, Biti halo abakeshlach manoach asher yitzavach. Now, most mefarshim, I think most of us read these psukim in this parak, is that what's Naomi concerned about? Well, we know the end of the story, because we're always reading the story at the beginning, knowing the end, because that's, it's sort of been a little spoiled for us. But so we know, knowing the end, that Boaz ultimately marries Ruth, so we assume that that's what the original plan was. Now, some of the most creative insights in Tanakh always challenge that assumption. They say, even though in the end of the story it became that way, but in the beginning of the story, who says that that's what everyone was thinking? So one wants to come up with creative ideas, that's one of the most important methods to apply. And we'll see that Sforno basically applies that here. And we'll see it already in the first pasuk. Halo avakeshlach manoach she'emkor hasadeh linedunyatech lemi sheyisaech. So what words are important? Lemi sheyisaech. Lemi sheyisaech, that's open-ended. It could be anyone. So the ata halo Boaz moldatanu asher hayitet narotav ve'eno ra'ui shenimkor bilti yediato behaskamato. The ra'ui latimo bazel ishar goalim. Why is Naomi sending Ruth to go speak to Boaz? Because we're going to sell the field. We're going to try to provide a dowry for you. That should only be done because he's a close relative. That should be done with his knowledge. Again, not because he's going to be the person who's necessarily going to marry you. The rachatz v'sach v'sam simultayi halayich v'yaradet hagoren al tivadei la'ish ad kaloto le'echol l'ishtot shetir'i panav mekushetet mipnei kvodo v'yachshiv otach li'ru'uya lehinasei to who? Le'ezer nichbad. Again, from Naomi's perspective, Boaz is the helpful person in the family. He's the elder and he's the patriarch of the family. Whatever his role is, he's somebody that they go to. He's been so helpful to them. He's somebody that they're going to go to help them solve this problem. Ruth has to find a proper person to marry. Now, this is a pasuk that's very bothersome for some people. So because it makes some people can read this, and there's certainly modern, not such frum commentaries who read it this way, that what's Ruth doing? She's seducing Boaz. Now, of course, And this could be one of the motivating factors. Chazal were, of course, aware of that possibility, and the Mefarshim were aware of that possibility. And Sforno, of course, doesn't want to go in that direction. And not only that, but Sforno continues. Vayochal Boaz vayesh vayitav libo vayavo lishka b'ktiya rima v'tavo balat v'tagam margota v'tishkav. So I'm sorry. Vayecherad haish mifnei chalom mavhil vayilafet yikalgel mitzad otzad u'v'chein lo yishan ad haboker ka'asher chashva. The whole plan was Ruth just wanted an opportunity to speak to Boaz in private. She wasn't expecting him to wake up in the middle of the night. He had a bad dream. He had a nightmare. He had a nightmare. He woke up. It wasn't planned. Wasn't anticipated. Nobody was seducing anybody for sure. Kal v'chomer. They were going to him for advice. Vayomer mi'at biti. With Panenu Lokatu BT, the footnote, Ela Mi'at, the Raga Haresha Amra Shehirut, Amar Brucha At Lashem BT. So BT is what Sforno is adding into the pasuk. Shechashavt Uti Le'av Le'inyan Yichud Ubakashat Ezrati. Ufarasta Chinafecha. So we think Ufarasta Chinafecha, Prisat Talit, where she's actually becoming his wife. Ufarasta Chinafecha, La'azor Uliyaetz. And al amatecha, Ruth, when she says al amatecha in the pasuk, al nami. According to Sforno, she's not even talking about herself because she's not talking about for marriage here. She's talking about asking for his help for not just for herself, but really for Naomi. Of course, it turns Ruth into a totally unselfish person, which matches the impressions that one gets from the rest of the Megillah. So this Perush and Megillat Ruth, you can agree or disagree, you can challenge it. It's certainly a very thought-provoking Perush. It's sort of consistent throughout the entire Perek Gimel. It's one of the examples of the pearls of Parshanut that we wouldn't have access to if not for all these manuscript discoveries, if not for the Madura Kama, the pre-Madura Kama, the Shirim of the student. And these are all, Baruch Hashem, all now available online and in hard copy. Sforno.mk@gmail.com. That's Rav Moshe's address. I hope I've done it. I haven't done it full justice, but I hope I've done enough that everyone should see the value in all the work that he's done. Thank you.